One of the things I noticed already before the panel was that there seemed to be some kind of route a border crossing being taken from theory towards practice, with, of course, Jean's quite philosophical paper at the beginning, and then a very interventionary paper by Misha at the end of the panel. I'll be continuing now to sort of deconstruct that distinction, of course, because, of course, it's a variant of the distinction which entitles the panel. It's the variant of the distinction between representation and the real, or between the fictional and the real. Theory and practice. Theory is equal to representation in this scheme, and practice would be equal to the real, which I think is a false distinction. And it's one which has been concerning us a lot at the University of Tromso, where I work within the Border Poetics research group. We're just finishing a project called Border Aesthetics, and some of you may have picked up the newspaper we produced together with Stoltjalat, the artist collective from St. Petersburg. It was up there. That was my little advert for today. There's another one as well, and that is when I begin my discussion here, I'll be going straight to what I think is perhaps one of the, let's say, overreaching goals of such discussions, and that is to find out what we mean and how we perform border concepts. Thus, the advert is for the large European research project EU Borderscapes, which has sort of introduced us to this idea of putting the changing border concept at the top of the agenda. And of course, by a changing border concept, we're not just talking about the way borders have changed historically, but we're talking about the way the actual concept of the border has changed historically. So that what is becoming very obvious during these couple of days already, that we're facing completely new ways of thinking the border. So partly we're referring back to a historical archive of borders, but partly we're also opening ourselves to the new. In fact, if we think of the word concept, it's related to a verb, to conceive. And of course, to conceive is actually to produce something new. It's to give birth, or to lead to giving birth. We could also use the German word Begriff, which means concept, which has to do with grasping something. Begriff, it's the hand which grasps something. So, so then the concept becomes a way of handling things, and that perhaps brings us back to this, what I feel is a false distinction between theory and practice, representation and the real. But on the other hand, we can also in German talk about an Eingriff, to actually to intervene in something and to do something. Thus I've already then suggested in this argument that the border concept is a form of representation. And I think that's already been made clear by several of the panelists here. We cannot talk about the border concept without using all kinds of metaphors and images of borders. But as I said, we must be very careful not to create a false distinction then between something which represents and something which is represented, between representation and the real, between perhaps the fictional and the real as well. And I think this is central to some new theorizing within border studies using the term borderscapes, which I have a feeling is fairly synonymous with the term which was introduced yesterday by Andrea Ria, the term border network, which was inspired by actor network theory. Borderscapes, which is more inspired by the work of Appadurai. Borderscapes really tries to explain the border as an assemblage of very many, both cultural, political, and other elements, which can constitute the act and process of bordering, which is also something which we've been introduced to yesterday. And it's also then, it becomes more and more obvious that when we talk about representation, we must think not only to avoid that binary fallacy between the real and the unreal, or the real and the symbolic, but also to think of representations and border concepts as performative acts. So they really do take part in our real world. A lot of the work we've been doing in Tromso has been concerned with representations of borders, and especially symbolic and narrative representations. And what we find is it's very typically of all the narratives we've been looking at, is that when somebody reaches the border, when somebody's about to cross the border, or somebody crosses the border, they meet something unreal, in a sense, fictional. There's all kind of weird doublings going on at the boarding. There are invisibilities. All this, for example, all this technological digitalization of the border, which goes on invisible, was an example of that. The border deals in masks, secrets, and has been mentioned during this panel, lies, and also what we literary researchers would call metaphors, fictions, fantasies, the imaginary. And Franco Moretti, an Italian literary scholar, has in his Atlas of the European Novel, has given a very good analysis of the way in literary texts, the way in which when characters reach a border, they are presented with metaphors. And his explanation is that the border is always accompanied by metaphors, because at the border you meet the other. And this is very quickly one can very quickly then think, oh, okay, on the other side of the border there's the other, we're ourselves, on the other side is the other. But I think what's increasingly happening in our changing borderscape, or changing border concepts, is that the other is not what's on the other side of the border, but it's the border itself which is the other. And it reflects on ourselves, so that we also become self-othered. And that's, I think, is something of the theme which has been going on here with, not only with the transgender identities and so on, but also, I think, something which Gadim was mentioning, this need not only to talk about oneself, one's own individual body, but a collective, a large number of people. So, that is to say, the border is a border to the other, but it's also a border as another. And that really says a lot about the epistemological status of borders. There's always a strange epistemology going on, a problematic epistemology. We cannot know everything about a border. We cannot see everything. There's always something in the way obscuring our vision. There is no bird's eye view. But that's really what I've been discussing now is what's typically found in representations of borders. And one of the reasons why the distinction between representation and the real is so problematic, why we cannot say that art and literature just reflect what's happening in the real borders, so to say, is because art and literature actually refract the borders. As I said, they're performative. And one of the reasons for this, and this is also pointed out during this panel by Jean, is that the border it's always already, to use one of Jacques Derrida's pet phrases, it's always already a representation and a fiction. The actual act of bordering, the act of demarcation is always to use a representation, it's to mark something. And I think there's much truth in our general intuition that borders are usually, can be experienced as very fictional. When we go to a border, we suddenly think, what's the difference between this side and the other? The border doesn't seem to fit. So that was just sort of fairly theoretical, meandering reflection to some questions to get this on the point, I think. First of all, I mean, this is perhaps also a theoretical question, but what happens when the border, if a border is always a representation or a fiction, what happens with it when it's negotiated by representations and fictions in literature, cinema, and art, for example? And underlying that is this intuition, then, that if we want to change the way borders work, we have to change their functioning as representations and fictions. And we also have to have a very, very wide conception of what can be a border. It's not just the Mexican-American border, but it's the borders to our bodies, and it's also the borders of the representations themselves of something we interpret and live with. So I think, first of all, the panel raised also some, especially Nick's paper, raised some very interesting questions about biographization, which Cedric introduced yesterday, and the necessity of telling lies. The way you cannot, I mean, this whole ridiculous idea that, for example, migrants are somehow suspicious because they tell lies, it seems very unethical to me. I mean, how could you avoid telling a lie? Because a border, you cannot describe a border without telling a lie because it's such an epistemological, difficult concept. There's also, going back to this previous discussions, there's this whole discussion about surveillance technology, which I think, as we've heard so much about it, it seems to be more and more that surveillance technology is there as a form of symbolic capital. I mean, it's obviously not cost effective. It's a symbolic capital which is meant as a spectacle for consumption. It creates an affective narrative which is there for people to consume. We've also addressed questions of invisibility and the virtuality of security, and that brings in the question which I think is very interesting. I've been working on this, on something on the same lines as well as what Jean was saying about distancing. So this is also a question I'd like the panel, in fact, to consider, and that's we live in an art world which is very influenced by modernism and postmodernism, and the most central aesthetic strategy within those forms is a form of distancing. It's what Shklovsky called defamiliarization, trying to see things with a new vision by estranging what is constructed social reality. Lastly, there's the paradox then. Some of the things we're trying to reach, an idea of border linking, as the psychoanalysts Bracher, Lichtenberg, Ettinger said, which replace our very, very Lacanian idea of the border as a cut, which cuts us off from the mother. If we're trying to reach that linking, why is it then that also the elites, the capital, is also trying to reach exactly the same form of linking and networking? is there a danger, this is a rhetorical question, is there a danger that art is reproducing exactly the same border concepts which are actually coming into force in the world of border security and control and economy? In a sense, going back to a theme of the last couple of days, globalization has not removed borders. It has just globalized them. Thank you.